We are delighted to have with us today two terrific leaders from AAPOR. Presenting first will be Courtney Kennedy. Courtney directs survey research at Pew Research Center. In this role, she serves as the Chief Survey Methodologist for the Center, providing guidance on all its research and leading its methodology work. She chaired AAPOR's evaluation of the 2016 U.S. election polls. She's worked as a statistical consultant on the U.S. Census Bureau's decennial census and on multiple reports appearing in Newsweek. Kennedy has a doctorate from the University of Michigan and a master's degree from the University of Maryland, both in survey methodology. She received her bachelor's degree from the University of Michigan. Following Courtney, we'll hear from Emily Guskin. Emily is the polling analyst at the Washington Post, specializing in public opinion about politics, election campaigns, and public policy, public policy. The polling team works alongside reporters throughout the newsroom and conducts polls at the national and local level. In addition to writing questionnaires and analyzing data, Emily also vets polls for internal usage, advises reporters on how to cover and write about polls, and sources polling data for reporters looking for public opinion data points for their stories. Emily has a master's degree in public policy from the Edward J. Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers, and undergraduate degrees in communication and government and politics from the University of Maryland. She serves as the chair of AAPOR's Journalism Education Subcommittee. Again, thank you all for being here, and let's get started. Courtney, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Thank you. Just trying to, let's see, get my slides loaded up here. Okay, I think we have it. All right, well, thank you everybody for joining us. So the reason that AAPOR wanted to hold this webinar is that both AAPOR and me in my role at Pew Research Center, these days we will get multiple contacts a week from journalists, and those contacts go something like, hey, I'm writing a story and starting from the place about how polls completely failed in 2016 and polling is broken. Can you help me out? And while that perception is obviously very understandable given the 2016 election, it's not actually grounded in the data record about how all of polling actually performed in 2016, much less more recently in 2018. And so this webinar is an opportunity to just have a very frank conversation about what the facts are in terms of why there absolutely were some misses in 2016, but it wasn't all polling. It certainly wasn't polling writ large. What did we learn, and what kind of things should journalists in particular look out for when they're vetting and reporting on polls in the future? So as I said, following the 2016 election, it was, you were bombarded with these headlines about how polling was quote unquote broken and polls were wrong, and on and on and on. It is true that there were some big problems with some polls in 2016. But what a lot of people don't realize is that those problems were primarily with state-level polls, especially some state polls in battleground states in the upper Midwest. National polls, by contrast, actually had quite a good year in 2016. As I'll show you, by historical standards, national polling had quite a good election. But that's obviously sort of a subplot that got lost in the aftermath of the election when you had, the person named the president, the Electoral College winner, not lining up with where a lot of the forecast and punditry had pointed. And so most of the content for what I'm going to be going over today comes from this quite comprehensive report that 12 colleagues from AAPOR and myself put together following the 2016 election. We were charged with analyzing how polls performed in that election, and we were actually organized before the election. AAPOR knew that it wanted to write this type of report, but you can imagine, in the days following the election, that task took on a whole new meaning. It kind of became, like a post-mortem exercise of figuring out, where things went wrong. And so this report is publicly available. It's on the AAPOR website. It's got all the gory details of what I'm going to be talking about. And I would also say, frankly, if you are an AAPOR member who is familiar with that report, maybe you read the report, this webinar is not really geared for you. This webinar is tailored more and designed more for folks, especially journalists, who are not really familiar with the content of that 2016 report. Okay, so one of the most important takeaways there is the fact that people aren't aware that national level polls in 2016 actually did quite well. And so here I'm talking about polls that are measuring the national popular vote of Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump. If you actually go back and look at the average of the final polls in 2016, they show that on average, Clinton had roughly a 3 percentage point lead over Donald Trump in the national popular vote. And the point of fact, she won that national popular vote by 2 percentage points. And so if you actually look at it that way, look at how those national polls did in that task of measuring that outcome, they did great. That's quite accurate to come within a percent of 1 percentage point of that, that delta between the top two candidates. So we, if you look at that, we really don't see evidence, certainly not strong evidence, that polls were broken at the national level in 2016. But like I said, people kind of missed that in all the discussion following it. So let's take a look at how that result compares to how polls do historically. So this line is charting the average error in final national election polls in presidential elections going back all the way to the 30s. And so here, higher values, like higher data points, are bad, right? Because that means more error on average in the polls. So what do we see? We see in 2016 that average error was quite low. Historically, that's pretty low. That's a very good election for national polls in terms of their accuracy. People forget, but back in the 30s, 40s, and the odd election since then, polling's been off by much more in terms of the national vote. And so if you look through this historic lens, you start to see that the 2016 election, while there absolutely were some problems, by no means does it mean that polling writ large was broken. It's just not the case. And the same trend, if you look here, not just sort of averaging all of the errors in the polls, but you look at the direction where polls miss. Did polls tend to miss overstating support for the GOP candidate, or did they tend to miss overstating support for the Democratic candidate? What we see here is that whether polls miss in the Republican direction or the Democratic direction is tantamount to a coin flip, especially in the past several decades. And I mention this because this always comes up, sadly. There's not any fact behind it, but I can almost guarantee you that this year there'll be pundits saying that the polls are biased, that the pollsters don't know what they're doing, they have their thumb on the scale, that the polls are biased. That's just not true, okay? I mean, so in 2016, sure, the polls, when they did miss, they slightly missed by overstating support by Clinton nationally. But guess what? In 2012, they slightly overstated support for Romney. And it kind of pings back and forth. So it's important to dispel this this notion that polling is systematically biased towards one party or another. It's just not true, and that this historical record bears that out. Okay, and I would also say for anyone who knows a pollster, public pollster, is familiar with the polling industry, public pollsters are not incentivized to be biased, right? They are not incentivized to skew their data in a way that's not going to line up with reality. Public pollsters are absolutely incentivized to have everything they put out be as accurate as possible, especially in the context of an election when they're going to be judged through this kind of exercise. So just let's be clear that there's no evidence that public pollsters have any systematic bias to their work. Okay. So I spent a few minutes talking about national polls and how actually they had a reasonably good election in 2016. But at this point, I think a lot of people's reaction was, well, okay, that's all well and good. But gosh, I remember very clearly thinking, the day after the election in 2016 that something was seriously off because I was told again and again Clinton was going to win, and it was just a question of by how much. How big is that blue wave going to be? So I can't, I know that there was something wrong in polling. What gives? Okay, so I mean, you just want the easy answer, like the highest level answer. Two things, right? The Electoral College. Because we have the Electoral College, it is possible, and in fact it's now happening, where we can have national polls polling the national popular vote, being very accurate, doing a very good job of polling that national popular vote, and yet they don't point to the correct winner sometimes because we don't obviously elect our presidents with that national popular vote. We do it with the Electoral College. So that's a big piece of this disconnect. And the second big piece is that, yes, there were a lot of problems. Not every state poll had problems, but where there were some polls off by 6, 7, 8 points, it was consequential. It was at these state level polls, especially ones in the upper Midwest, and I'll unpack that a bit more here. But with this slide, we're going to focus in on the average accuracy. Let me just say it more specific to this slide. The average level of error in state level polls, right? Previously, a couple of slides back, I showed you national polls. This is looking at just state level polls and how accurate those final polls were. This timeline goes back to 2000. If you go back before that, there were a lot less state polls being done. They weren't documented very well, so we just don't quite have that long historical record. But anyway, with this record that we have on hand, we see something really important. We see that in 2016, that was, within this time period, a historically high level of error on average in the state polls. So yes, state polling had a historically bad year in 2016. And as you can see, the direction of it was overstating support for Clinton. That's what the blue bar means, whereas the red bars mean that polls tended to overstate support for the GOP candidate. Okay. So we know state polls struggled in 2016. Why is that the case? Well, that's what chapters and chapters of that report that I mentioned are devoted to. Large group of us, we looked into many possible explanations about why those polls were off in 2016. And so what did we find? Well, we found that there's not just one smoking gun in terms of why polls were off in 2016. There were several factors that all worked in that same direction of contributing to some state level polls overestimating support for Clinton. So, the fancy way to say that it was not a monocausal event. It was a multi-causal event. And when we look at what are the factors where we found the most evidence that they sort of dictated what went wrong, really two things. One, there's pretty strong evidence that there was a late break in Trump's favor among undecided voters. And the second piece is that there's also very strong evidence that most state polls were not weighted properly. And so weighting is statistical process that every pollster needs to go through after they've done their data collection, they've conducted their interviews, now they have their data set. And so at that point in time, the pollster needs to take that interview data and make it as representative as possible of the population they're trying to speak to, whether it's all U.S. adults or whether it's people in a certain state or likely voters, whatever it is. The pollster needs to weight their data to make it as representative as possible. And there was a big problem with that, especially in the state polls in 2016. Okay, let me show you the evidence for the late swing towards Trump. And I would just remind everybody, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump in 2016 were two historically unpopular candidates. There was a real share of the voting public who frankly did not like either one. They really didn't, and they really struggled with this decision of whom to choose or whether to vote at all. And so we absolutely had a share of the public that was legitimately undecided deep into that campaign. And so when polls were done in September or even early October, that's what pollsters were getting. They had, these undecided voters. Some of them might have been considering a third-party candidate here and there, but that was definitely going on. But what we see from surveys conducted with folks like that, so the exit poll in particular asked people on election day, okay, when did you make up your mind about whom you're going to vote for? And the people who said, I made up my mind in the past week, in 2016, they broke for Trump in these key battleground states by on the order of 15 to 20 percentage points, which is historically pretty unusual. Typically, undecided voters that deep into the campaign, they tend to wash out about evenly between the two major party candidates. But in 2016, you had an overwhelming break in these key states in Trump's favor. And so what does that mean? Well, in terms of polls and whether or not a poll works, this just means that a lot of polls were conducted too early in the calendar to measure this, to pick up this late swing. So if you did a poll in, the middle of October and you didn't catch this late break for Trump, it doesn't mean that your poll was broken or your poll was wrong. It just means that your poll was conducted before these people made up their mind and the pollster had an opportunity to measure that. So that's one important thing that we found pretty strong evidence for. The other thing that I mentioned is this issue of weighting. And let me just say for folks who might not be, polling experts, pollsters have known for decades and decades that certain types of people are more likely to take surveys than others. And that tends to be, we see that older Americans, like senior citizens, are often more likely to take surveys than younger ones. It is the case that Caucasians, on average, tend to be more likely to take surveys than non-whites. And it's the case that people who have more formal education, especially college graduates, tend to be more likely to take surveys than people with less formal education. And that doesn't mean that, everybody with a PhD always takes a survey and that all, young people never take polls, but I'm just talking about averages. I'm talking about the pattern. And these patterns are quite well understood and well established at this point in time. And because of those patterns, because different subgroups are more likely to respond to the poll than others, that's why pollsters have to weight their data, as I mentioned earlier, to make it nationally representative. Okay, so this needs to happen. And places like where I work at Pew Research Center, or at Gallup, or ABC News, and Fox News, on down the line, a lot of the national sort of well-known pollsters that you've heard of and familiar with know these things and have been waiting on age, gender, education, race, geography. We've been weighting all these things for decades in our polls. And, I think, frankly, a lot of people like me assumed that everybody else in the industry knew that and was basically more or less doing the same practice. And that turned out to be false. What we saw is that in 2016, if you look at what state pollsters were doing, not all state pollsters, but a lot of them, they were not waiting on education. And this was, frankly, a real surprise, I have to say, because I've seen for decades that if we go out and do data collection, we're going to have too many college graduates in our sample by a lot, and we have to fix that. But it turns out to be that with these state polls, they were not fixing that. So what did that look like? Well, if you pull up a press release from one of these state polls in 2016, it'll often say something like, we conducted 1,000 interviews, and we weighted the data on age, gender, and geography. And you won't see education. Again, sometimes you'll see it, but the majority of the time, they were not waiting on education. And what this table is showing you is in a lot of these state level polls, the CPS, that's a benchmark, that's a really high quality survey done by the federal government that shows you what share of folks in those states are actually college graduates, and it's in the 30s, and you can lay that alongside the share of college graduates in these state level polls in those same places, and they're way too high. Okay, and so it's very clear that most, if not all, state polls conducted in 2016 had too many college graduates. That frankly wouldn't be a problem if education was kind of unrelated to how people voted in 2016, but in fact the opposite was true. In 2016, there was a very strong relationship between a voter's level of formal education and how they voted for president. And what this line chart is showing you is that on average, college graduates, definitely postgraduates, broke for Clinton, and voters with less formal education, high school or less, or some college, broke for Trump. Now, again, it doesn't mean that every person with just a high school education voted for Trump. A lot of them voted for Clinton. But again, I'm talking about the averages. I'm talking about that overall pattern. And the key thing in the context of this discussion about state-level polling is that if you did your poll in, say, Wisconsin or Michigan, you had way too many college graduates responding, and you didn't fix it, you had way too many Clinton voters. And that's where the most of that error came from, okay? They had too many college graduates, they didn't fix it in their weighting, and they had too many Clinton voters. And so I would sort of flag this. Any reporter I talk to, I flag this. And, you might think or hope that, okay, AAPOR did this report several years ago. It had this very clear finding. You'd think that all the pollsters would sort of sit up, pay attention, and if they weren't already fixing this issue, that they would go ahead and do so. And some did. There definitely are a number of pollsters who saw this finding about 2016. They saw what happened, and yes, they fixed their weighting. They've, to the extent that possible that we know about, they added an adjustment for education in their weighting protocol, but many have not. And I double checked this morning. You can go on these aggregator websites right now and find multiple polls, especially at the state level, that are not fixing this education issue. And you can see that they are vastly overrepresenting the views of college-educated voters who often, especially in these sort of northern states, are skewing Democratic. So if you are responsible for reporting on polls or vetting polls, you absolutely want to be aware of this and look for in the methodology statement, hey, did this pollster make sure that their poll was representative on age, gender, race, depending on the state, and education? And you want to see that in there. And I should note that some pollsters do something that's not quite that, but real similar. Like there's one well-known pollster that weights on income. But guess what? Income is highly correlated with education, so that may be good enough. It might be sort of checking the same box, so that you do see a bit about that. But still, there are many pollsters still out there that are not doing anything in order to kind of fix this education issue. And if you see that and you still want to report on a poll, I would encourage you to have a conversation with this pollster about why they think their poll is accurate despite not fixing this very well-established issue. Okay, and this next table shows you exactly for 2016, state by state and nationally, what percentage of the pollsters were adjusting on this. And you can see in like Michigan, it was like only 18% of the polls were fixing this education issue, and the rest were not. In other battleground states, it was in the 20s or the 30s. And then you see nationally, where it's certainly not everybody nationally, but it's kind of a slim majority of national pollsters in 2016 were fixing this issue. Okay, so those were the two main factors where we found the most evidence about why polls were off in 2016. I also want to mention what we found in terms of the shy Trump effect, and it's not because there's a lot of data to support it, but this still is on people's minds. It got a ton of attention and discussion from talking heads in 2016. People love to sort of speculate about it. And for those of you who might not remember, the shy Trump effect is this speculation that some Trump voters, if they are taking a poll and they're talking to an interviewer, that they're going to lie about their support for Trump. They won't disclose it because, I don't know, like they feel embarrassed or they feel it's stigmatized. I don't know. That's what the speculation is. But the speculation is, right, that polls are under measuring support for Trump because Trump supporters are purposefully not being honest about their support. And as I said, this got wide speculation in 2016. But today I want to take this opportunity to talk to you about what actually the facts are. There is shockingly little support for this notion. People love to talk about it, but there's very little data to support it. So in terms of this committee that I served on, we did 5 different tests trying to find support for the shy Trump hypothesis. And each test turned up either no evidence to support it or a little evidence, very minor, on the order of maybe a percentage point or maybe 2 at the outside. But what I can tell you confidently is this is not the main reason why polls were off in 2016. It might have played a minor role, again, on the order of maybe a point or 2, but this does not explain the 6-7 percentage point errors that we saw in some of the states. And I want to be clear, am I saying that no one ever lies to pollsters? No. I mean, if I go out and interview 1,000 people, there might be a few that, sort of intentionally tell us the wrong thing. But by and large, that's really rare. It doesn't tend to be systematic. And it really doesn't tend to be a serious threat for poll results, especially now that pollsters are moving online. And there's still some phone polls that are done, but each year that goes by, more and more are done online where there's no interviewer. And, it's hard to kind of imagine a scenario where someone would feel compelled to lie when they're just, clicking a box on a website, right? So you should know that, next time somebody tells you, oh, that poll's wrong because of the shy Trump effect, press them. Be like, what is your evidence for that? Because, a committee of 13 expert pollsters looked into that and they found almost nothing. That's really kind of a red herring in terms of the problems with polling these days. Okay, so that is basically the highlight of the 2016 election, what we learned. What about 2018? Well, if you look at, so in 2018, sort of, the main outcome there was which party is going to take control of the House of Representatives, right? Because it was a midterm election. And the main thing we look for is what's called the generic House ballot. So pollsters, when they interview somebody, they say, do you plan to vote for the Democrat or Republican candidate for U.S. House of Representatives in your district? Something along those lines. But that's what they're trying to measure. And so if you look at that generic House vote in 2018, you look at what was the average of the final polls, they showed the Democrats ahead by about 7 percentage points for the House of Representatives. Well, what happened? Democrats won by about 8 percentage points. So let's put the final nail in this coffin. Polling writ large is not broken. That's a very accurate performance by the polls on average in 2018. And as I said, in 2016, if you look at the national polls, the story was the same. So, to come within a point of that generic House vote is quite good for polling. There's also another piece of analysis that sort of speaks to this broader issue. So there's two academics, Jennings and Williesian, and they were interested in the question of how has the accuracy of polling changed over time, but around the world. So they took on this Herculean task of gathering hundreds of polls from countries around the world and plotting the average level of accuracy over time. And, all of the sort of hype and the hubbub and the speculation is this sentiment that, the past few elections have shown us that polling is broken. Okay, if that were the case, what you would see in this chart is that line at the far right side in the most recent elections would be going up, right? It'd be spiking. It'd be showing more error in recent elections and recent years than in the past. And as you can see, that's not the pattern at all. The past few years, if you look at average polling accuracy around the world, it's really pretty stable, and it absolutely doesn't suggest that there's some systematic spike in terms of polls being inaccurate. Okay. So, I try to give a level presentation here. It's not that polls are perfect. Polls, do absolutely have their limits. They have their flaws. Polling is not up to the task of calling the right winner in a very close election. It's just not. They're not built to do that. So I don't want people to overread what I'm saying here. And in 2016, as I sort of went through in gory detail, there absolutely were some problems with state polls in particular. Not all state polls, but enough to really be a problem. So that said, polling is still very valuable. Polls, if they're done rigorously, if they're done by an organization with expertise and resources and a good track record, they are still producing very valuable information. They can give us a very good idea about, generally speaking, how much public support is there for policy A or policy B, how much support is there for candidate A or candidate B. Polls are absolutely still up to that task of giving us, very useful, high-level information, even though they're not up to the task of always calling the winner right in a very close election. And so national polls, they did well in 2016. They did very well in 2018. I think as for journalists who are tasked with covering polls, you still have to be eyes wide open, because even though we learned a whole lot about what happened in 2016, and it's heartening that a lot of what we found is fixable, not all pollsters have taken the steps to fix that. So eyes wide open. And I'd just like to thank you all for your time today, and I'll turn it over to Emily.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Starting off with my presentation, as Courtney beautifully handed off to me, I'm hoping to give you all the tools with which to responsibly report on polling in 2020 and beyond. And so what we're going to do today is take a look at the AAPOR website, where we've got a bunch of different free accessible tools that are specifically created for journalists who are covering polls and journalists who don't have a lot of time and want something that they can turn to quickly to answer their questions. So everything that we'll be discussing today is linked to on this website that's at the bottom of this slide. And if you'd like, you can go there now and we can talk about things, and you can look at them as I discuss them. So the tools that we've got are to help journalists decide whether a poll is quality or if it's not quality and they should avoid reporting on it, guidance for what to look for to answer that question and how to write about it, tips on writing, and specifics about election polling, which can be different than non-election polling. We also have a free online course that is self-guided, so you don't have to come at a certain time, and you can take a course on reporting on polling that was created, and again, it's free. So if you've got a few minutes to spare and want to do a deep dive on this stuff, it's accessible, it's free, and the link is on this page that I've linked to below. So this is that page that we talked about. It looks a little bit different now. It's the For Media page. We've updated it a bit and changed some of the links, but that means we're keeping it updated and we're giving you the latest and the best tools that we've got at that time to provide you with resources and guidance for covering polling. The first thing we're going to talk about is the journalist cheat sheet, and right now that's the second link on the For Media page. This is something we created pretty recently, and it is actually a one-page document, so you can print it out and tack it on your cubicle desk or just print it out to read through easily. It's things to keep in mind when you're reporting on public polling, and it's even got some links in it to help answer some of your questions if you're feeling a bit lost. So we've set this up as a what, who, when, how. There's no why, because the why is you're writing about polling because it's great and it can help guide your readers. But we've broken these things down with these questions, and I'm going to go through some of them right now. I know the slide is kind of tiny because, yes, I had to fit it all on one page. So the first questions are what? So what questions are asked in the poll? Are the questions balanced? Are they confusing? Are they leading? Any poll worth its salt should be able to give you the questions that they ask. You can reach out to a pollster and ask for what we call a top line or a trend document that should have the questions in the order that they were asked. Some pollsters, myself included, will keep some questions held back for later reporting, and that is okay because you want to make sure that the questions that you're reporting on are fairly worded, and the only way to know that is to look at them. We also care about the order in which questions were asked. Questions can influence one another. If you ask a question at the beginning, that can relate to something later. Granted, this will happen anyway, but it's a good thing to keep in mind when you're reading a questionnaire. We also like to know what other polls have been done on a topic. Polls can be outliers and can show different results than others. So if other things have been conducted on the same topic, it's a good idea to search what has been done before and see if polls were taken at a different time or among a different population, how that might differ. There are two places that I recommend going to in this document, and they're linked to in there. Also note that different question wording and methods can influence the responses of a question. So if a survey was taken online, or if it was over the phone, or if it was taken 7 weeks ago, things can be different, but it's a good idea to compare these things so that you know where the poll stands, and it's quick to do a search like that. We also want to know what the margin of sampling error is. This is a huge thing for pollsters, and it really will help guide what you're writing about, especially when it comes to election polling. All of us have seen headlines that have said a candidate is ahead of another candidate when sometimes the difference is only 1 or 2 points. In most cases, there's not actually a difference between those two candidates standing in an election or in a race. So we use margin of sampling error, which is usually we see among different polls. It can be different, but a good pollster will report that margin. And there's a little tool in here in this cheat sheet that if a sample to read, and a candidate usually needs to be ahead by 1.5 or 2 times the margin of sampling error for the lead to be statistically significant. Now, this can vary, but a lot of times when you're reading about polls and the difference is smaller than 1.5 or 2 times between the two candidates, you should not say that that is an actual difference between candidates. If there's more questions on this, we can go into it later, but this is if you take away one thing from this presentation, it's to remember that margin of sampling error makes a huge difference when you're reporting when you're reporting election polling. Moving down to who in this, and this is the longest part of my presentation. The who conducted the poll, take stock in who is doing the polling. If it's an internal campaign poll, sometimes campaigns only will release a poll if it's positive news for their candidate. So keep that in mind when you're reading it. Maybe ask a pollster for the different candidate what they see. Advocacy groups release polls a lot too. Pay special attention to the wording in those questions, because if they're advocating, they're probably advocating for a certain thing. So you want to have your antenna up for things of that nature. Also, reputable polling firms should provide a method statement, should have that error margin, should explain when they were in the field, the methods that they used for conducting their poll, and should be able to answer these questions here. Are the results based on the answers of all the people interviewed or only a subset? Pay attention to the population so that when you're reporting, you can be clear whether the population was of likely voters, or of registered voters, or of Americans overall, or of Black Americans, or all of these different populations really make a difference in when you're reporting. The next few things, when were the interviews conducted? Keep in mind if you're doing some issue polling on, say, gun control, and the poll was in the field recently after a major shooting, that could affect opinion. That's just an example there. We also have questions here about how the poll was conducted, which I spoke about briefly, and explains the difference between a probability sample and a non-probability sample, and something that Courtney mentioned, the importance of weighting to try to correct for ways the sample might be unrepresentative. So weighting, modes, probability, and non-probability, these are all things that you can ask of the pollsters that will help you to report more clearly, and even have your little nut graph at the bottom explaining what the poll is, because those are questions readers might have. And there's also more information in this one page, I promise, even though I've been talking a lot, it's only one page on weighting and the importance of that. So this is, I think, hopefully a helpful tool for when you're reporting on polls. We've got a similar document that's questions to ask when writing about polls, which sounds like the previous question document, but this is more straightforward. It's only 12 questions. You can ask pollsters these questions when you are reporting on those polls, and it can help you decide whether or not you want to report on those polls. There's a post there also by Courtney's colleague, John Gramlish, who wrote tips for writing about polls, which I think is a really handy 7-minute read because it's on Medium, so it tells you how long it is, explanation of ways to write more clearly about polls. And he breaks it down really well, and I think it's a nice, simply worded way to understand what you're doing. It covers some of the things I mentioned before, like being clear about who was surveyed, Americans, registered voters, etc. When the survey was conducted, pay attention to survey wording, and of course, margins of error. One thing that he brings up in this write-up that I didn't mention before is that it's dangerous to ascribe causality when you're looking at polling results. So we can't usually say from what we read in questionnaire design that something caused something else to happen, but we can say that people do feel this way. Hopefully that made sense. If not, you can read that write-up. We've also got a page that's mostly links. It's called Election Polling Resources. It's a little further down the For Media page. And if you need to figure out what likely voters mean, or what's an automated poll, or online panels and how they're different than than opt-in panels, there's tools here where you can just basically Control F on this one pager to explain exit polls and push polls and all sorts of different questions that you might have about election polling. So it's a good one-stop source for answering election polling questions. Also, we update this. So if you come here, you're not going to find, yes, it does say evidence from the 2014 U.S. House elections, but that's a relevant likely voter report. But all of the different details and the short explanations have been updated in recent years and months. We also have the course, which I spoke about a little bit previously, called Understand and Interpreting Polls. I noticed that some of the journals we have on here today are international. We've got courses, desperate courses, both for U.S. audiences and for international polls. And it's a self-directed online course, and it will help you identify elements of a valid poll, understand the methods box, which we mentioned before, which should explain the different parts of a poll, analyze the quality of questions, understand weighting, and it's a deeper dive into all the things we've already discussed and should make you the expert in your newsroom on interpreting and understanding polls. Again, it's free. We've also got a page there about poll and survey frequently asked questions, which has links to things that you might think of while you're writing up, and everyone's on a deadline, so it's a good place to turn to. And things are written so that people can understand it and that you can use that language to explain things to yourself and others. Finally, if you're still lost and need a quote from a survey expert, we've got a Contact AAPOR link here, which is experts@aapor.org, who you can email and ask questions and get responses and learn if you need a short explanation of anything. And that is all I've got there.
Thank you so much, Courtney and Emily. We now have time for questions. If you have any questions, please remember to submit your questions in the chat box at the bottom of the screen. We've already got some going, so I'm going to get started right away here with a few questions. The first is, I think this one is for Courtney. How did the polls perform in the 2016 primaries?
They did reasonably well. I would say the primary polls in 2016 were kind of historically unremarkable. You know, it's kind of about an average performance in terms of how well primary polls usually do. Now, primaries are notoriously difficult to poll and to poll accurately, because in a general election, you know, you've got the two major parties for voters, especially like less engaged, less informed voters, to kind of help inform their decision. But in primaries, obviously, it's all this, you know, inter-party or intra-party competition, I should say. And people's opinions are really fluid. You know, what happens in one caucus or one primary can be strongly affected by what happened, you know, in one just a few days ago. So it's just an incredibly dynamic, fluid situation. It's really hard to poll primaries. So, you know, in 2016, they did all right. It wasn't, you know, particularly strong or particularly poor, but kind of about average.
Okay, this questioner would like to know, where are you looking for on average data about polls? Is it the aggregate data of many polls over the course of a period, as one finds on Real Clear Politics and 538? And is there a bias evaluation tool for polls anywhere, like there is with Ad Fonte's media work on news source writ large?
Well, I'll take a crack at that, and maybe Emily has more to add. It's definitely true that there are several aggregator websites out there, and I would agree that Real Clear Politics and 538.com are probably the most prominent, the most well-known of those aggregator websites. And, you know, there is a conceptual, really strong idea there. You know, in theory, if you've got 10 pollsters all measuring the same outcome, it's smart and it's a good idea. You'll have a more accurate idea to combine all that information in some type of way, as opposed to just relying on one of those polls. So I mean, I think that there is definitely value in that type of exercise. The part that I worry about is that in today's era of polling, not all polls are created equal, right? Some polls cost $50,000 to $100,000 and are done by, you know, people that have been in the field for 2 or 3 decades and have really strong resources and track record. And other polls might be by a pollster where it's their first time doing a poll and they don't have any formal training. And you know, we didn't get into this today, but you know, one thing to know about the polling field is that the barriers to being a pollster have all but been eliminated, right? Anyone can kind of go out and quote unquote do a poll if they've got a few $1,000s in their pocket. It doesn't mean it's a good poll and doesn't mean it should be trusted. And I raise it in this aggregator conversation because a lot of those aggregators tend to be very inclusive in terms of what they're willing to count as a public poll that they're going to, you know, put on their website and enter into their models. And so I worry that sometimes, you know, very low rigor polls might not be adding a lot of useful information there. It tends to be a real mixed bag. So kind of buyer beware when doing that type of exercise. And in terms of, there was a part of that question was about like bias or error removal, and I'm not familiar with what that website mentioned was. In general, during election year, it's you tend to see some things like that pop up. In my experience, they're usually not very trustworthy or useful because they kind of will either glom on to one particular feature of a poll and ignore everything else, and all those everything else factors are usually more important. Or they, you know, they just, I don't know, I think the assumptions that go into a sort of a prepackaged thing like that are often maybe not the best.
I'll echo what Courtney said, that I'm also concerned about everything being lumped together in these aggregators. And sometimes an average isn't better than a recent high-quality poll. I think we have the tendency to think that more is better, and averaging things together might be, but there's lots of polls of varying standards, and sometimes something more recent is more helpful. Also, a good thing to keep in mind is that polls are snapshots in time and not predictors or anything that's more than what was taken at that time. So if you're averaging a whole mess of polls together, opinion can change over time and you're mushing a bunch of opinions together. That being said, I do average polls together for some purposes professionally. And I do use several of the aggregators that are out there just to see what's there, because they're also good places to see what is the most recent poll that was in the field that's being tracked by those aggregators.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for those answers. So this listener, Paul, would like you to know that he is also from Michigan. So I don't know, go Big Blue, right? Anyway, he asks whether how large cities and how metropolitan areas in places like Detroit, Madison, and Philly can swing the whole state, and maybe, I guess, introduce a liberal bias.
Well, I mean, cities are important in this context just because they have such a high concentration of votes. And yeah, it's absolutely true that in general, cities tend to be home to more Democratic voters as opposed to GOP voters. And it is true that I think an important part of understanding the 2016 election was understanding what happened in some of the urban centers like Detroit and Milwaukee and so forth. I think all that's true. I think it's consequential if people in those parts of especially so urban centers and battleground states, right? If there's high turnout, that's going to have an impact. That's going to mean more support for the Democratic candidate, generally speaking. So they are consequential. I didn't sort of make the link to there being some sort of bias, but they're absolutely consequential for those reasons.
Okay, great. Thank you for those answers. Appreciate that. Okay, this one is for Courtney. How does one know if if a survey has been properly weighted? You mentioned the CPS survey. Are there other ways to determine what the baseline percentages for specific demographic groups should be?
Sure. This information is all really publicly available in terms of what the target should be. It's just it's kind of a high bar in terms of resources and skills to be able to process that data. But if you have the tools and the training, it's just a matter of downloading either the micro data sets or in some case maybe the pre-made tables. The most common sources pollsters use are the CPS, the Current Population Survey, or the American Community Survey. Those are both very large, very high quality surveys conducted that can give you either national estimates or estimates at the state level. So they're super useful in elections. And the CPS gets mentioned a lot by election pollsters because they don't ask who you voted for, but they do ask whether you voted. And so when we want to look and understand, okay, what is the profile of people who tend to vote in a mid-year election? What are those demographics? The CPS is really a great source for that. Or what is the profile of people that tend to vote in a presidential election in this state? So those are really useful resources.
Okay, great. Thank you. So this questioner asks, how do you make sure that you are reaching the populations you need to in survey distribution? Is there a way to guard against the lack of some demographics, such as people of color or non-educated people, in fielding to make sure that polls are as representative as possible?
I can speak to this. One way to do that is to randomly sample the entire universe that you're hoping to measure. So if you are just picking here and there on your own of people who should respond, you're not going to get, like if you just ask your friends, you're not going to get a random sample that's representative of the population. If you just ask people in the District of Columbia, you're not going to get a random sampling of all Americans. So you have to ensure that everyone who's in the survey everyone who's being represented has an equal chance of being surveyed. So a random sample of Americans, pollsters often use what's called random digit dialing, which randomizes numbers that they dial. Most pollsters these days use more cell phones than landlines because more people have cell phones these days than are landlines, and landlines tend to be older, whiter people. So to reach a broader swath of the population, randomly sampling cell phones. If it's a survey that's just reaching people on landlines, you're not reaching the whole population. There's also web surveys, and probability-based web surveys get people to join those panels based on randomly sampling to put them online. So they'll even get people who don't have the internet to be on their panel because those people are representing those who are not on the internet. And a good probability-based panel will provide a way for that person to respond to web surveys even if they don't have web access. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, great, thank you. So from a polling perspective, is there anything in the 2020 election which may be unusual or different than previous years that we may want to pay close attention to? I think this is for both of you, so I'm gonna call on Emily first.
I'm not really sure how to answer that. I think we definitely want to pay attention to the increase of online polling. There's more of it now than there was 4 and 8 years ago, and pay attention to the methodology of those polls. There's also a more diverse population now than there was 4 and 8 years ago. The United States continues to be diverse and more and more diverse than it was and less white, so it's good to ensure that the polls that you're looking at reflect the population of the United States. If they're only landline polls, it's going to be a lot of old white people, which does not reflect the population of the United States.
I would add to that, it's kind of a riff off that thought. So one reason that 2016 proved difficult for pollsters is that in a lot of ways, the electorate did not look a whole lot like the 2 elections that came before when Obama won. 2008 and 2012, were both relatively high in terms of turnout, in terms of non-white turnout, and those things. And 2016 was quite different. And it matters for polling accuracy because when I talk about weighting or we talk about modeling, really what we're talking about is the pollster relying on this notion that they have a good portrait of what voters look like in terms of all these demographic distributions. And we're quite reliant on the past recent elections to inform what we think that portrait's going to be like. And so polling in 2012 turned out to be not too hard because it looked a lot like 2008. But 2016 was quite different. And if you look back, you have your 2016 election and all of its characteristics. 2018 was vastly different, right? I mean, it was a historically high turnout for a midterm. And it was, at least in terms of like nationally, it was more democratic than 2016. And I think pollsters are kind of in this moment where there's quite a bit of uncertainty in terms of what should that portrait look like? What is our best guess of turnout and the demographic portrait of those who do turn out? And I would say that in 2020 is kind of, there's perhaps more uncertainty in what that model should look like than usual. And so that is, kind of dicey.
Okay, I want to go back to talking a little bit about online polls. I see a lot of polls on social media, polls coming at me on Facebook and Twitter, and then people citing those polls. What are some of the special cautions? What are some of the things that we should be looking at when we are trying to evaluate an online poll?
Well, online polls versus polls shared on social media. Look at the methodology statement. Any poll should have one. Any good poll should have one. If they don't, reach out for one. AAPOR has a transparency initiative where there are certain things, all the things we've discussed, that a poll should be transparent about in order for you to be fully aware of what that poll was doing and what it was measuring. I see polls all the time on Twitter that people just retweet probably without looking for that methodology statement. So the more you know before you retweet, I think in general is a good rule to live by. But see where it's coming from, who the person is, ask those questions that we've provided for you on the AAPOR website before you share and report on different polls.
Okay, great. So this questioner asks, should a news organization ever say that a candidate is leading in a poll if the candidate is not leading by more than 1.5 or 2 times the margin of error? If not, why do we keep seeing this happen?
That's a great question. And I didn't even ask it myself. That was actually someone who asked it looks like. News organizations should not say a candidate is leading if the 2 candidates are within the margin of error and are not 1.5 or 2 times the size of the margin of error. I think people are confused about margin of error and don't understand it exactly, which is totally reasonable since it's not that clear to understand. And people see numbers and see that 28 is ahead of 27 and want to write a quick thing saying that one is ahead of the other, when in most cases, in fact, no one is leading by 1 point. There are tools and words you can use to define something being close. I sometimes say about head-to-head or near even or virtually tied for first when there are more than 2 people up there, but there are some certain trick words that you can use while you're writing these things to explain that there is not, in fact, a lead when there's only a 1 point difference in election polling. And I wish we weren't seeing it happen so much, so hopefully tools that AAPOR provides can help educate people who are reporting on polls to report more effectively.
Okay, thank you. So this questioner asks, he often hears the argument that polls can't be accurate because he's never been polled. Or what's your best non-science-y response to this to help certain people believe in the legitimacy of polling?
One way I like it to, well, sure. I mean, you can think about the science this way. If you go to the doctor and they need to draw some of your blood for testing, do you want to tell your doctor to take all of it? Or can you just trust the fact that if they take a vial worth, that's enough? That is random sampling in everyday life. Your doctor draws a random sample of the blood in your body, and 1 vial of blood is just as good as the next one, or any other vial of blood, and that works because the blood is randomly distributed. With polling, it's the same basic idea. If you are able to achieve the randomness, if you have the tools in place to draw a random sample that's itself representative of the larger public, you do not need to interview everybody. You don't even need to interview that many people. You really only need to interview a few thousand to achieve, good accuracy.
And having a larger sample, like of hundreds of thousands of people, doesn't necessarily make it better if you're not sampling properly. I love the analogy of drawing blood and use it a lot, and some of my friends are grossed out by it. Probably they're more grossed out by the fact that I'm constantly talking about polling. But there's another analogy I like to use too, and it's the soup one. If you want to taste whether your soup is good or not, you mix it up, take a spoonful, and you're good to serve it. That's also random sampling.
Okay, we have time for just a couple more questions. Here is one. A listener asks, why even do nationwide polling regarding the presidential election when only the Electoral College results matter?
I think that's a good question. I mean, I honestly think that there's a strong argument to look at it both ways these days. There's no question that the Electoral College is in terms of who might win, the consequential thing. So I think we cannot ignore that, especially at this moment in political history. I would say that there is value from understanding how the entire public is feeling, though. If we as pollsters, I like to think that we're sort of documenting for posterity, well, where were Americans on gun control, or on abortion, on different candidates and different policies. And I think from that sort of high level perspective, or even thinking about legislatures who are responsible for governing all Americans, not just Americans in battleground states, right? There is value in knowing how all Americans feel on certain issues. So I'd say there's good arguments for both right now.
Whoops. Sorry. So one last question. Courtney was speaking about 2008, 2012, 2016, and 2018 looking different in terms of turnout, and in terms of shifts in U.S. demographics. Could you say more, Courtney, about how pollsters and those who report on them should account for this? What is the shifting, and what must we be cautious about?
So in 2008 and 2012, probably with some influence from Barack Obama being on the ballot, there was relatively high turnout among non-whites, especially African Americans, a well-known Democratic constituency. That mattered, right? And so if you're doing a poll and you're waiting to try to make sure that the racial distribution is as accurate as possible, you would have had to factor in relatively high turnout among that part of the public in order to get that exactly right. Or if you underestimated how high that turnout was going to be in those elections, you probably would have underestimated support for Obama. That's really all I'm talking about here. So, I mean, in terms of vetting polls, this really goes to the likely voter model, which is, it could be a webinar topic unto its own. And it's a pretty complex topic because I think it's safe to say no two pollsters do it exactly the same way, and maybe Emily could speak to it more than I can. But I think if you're if you're a journalist and you're concerned about this, you could reach out to a pollster and ask them, what are their expectations for turnout in the electorate? What does that look like in their likely voter model? What are they anticipating that the electorate is going to look like on election day? And if the pollsters, knows their job and is engaged in doing likely voter modeling, they should be able to have that conversation.
Okay,
sorry, I hadn't unmuted myself.
Thank you.
Oh,
Emily?
Courtney handed me the baton, so really quickly, it looks like that person who asked the question also saw that he or she thought that there was a shift in a growing share of Democrats and Democrat-leaning independents, and we see the trend hasn't really changed all that much recently in Party ID. Pew collects it, and there's a few other organizations that have long trend lines that you can look at, beautifully visualized, and see trends in Party ID, but there doesn't seem to be that much of a recent shift in Party ID.
Okay, I think we have reached the end of our webinar. On behalf of AAPOR, my thanks indeed to Courtney and Emily for their excellent presentation. We also thank all of you who listened for your participation. Remember to watch for future webinars sponsored by AAPOR. And directly following the webinar, a survey will appear on your screen. If you could please complete the survey to help us serve your needs in the future, that would be really great. You know how we feel about polling. So this concludes our program for today, and we hope you all have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you very much.